So once we have the render settings up, I just want to lower this down so it doesn't take as long. So I'm under the common tab here at the top, and under the output size, I'm going to lock this value in, and I'm going to change it to something like 600 for my top value, and then the bottom one will adjust automatically since I'm locking in that aspect ratio. I mean, you could change both of them if you wanted to. And you can see on my screen right now, I have my safe frame showing, which is just if I click with my scroll button to get over to my screen and I hit Shift F. That's without the safe frame, and then that's with the safe frame. So that's basically letting me see what that image aspect ratio is. So I think it was at 338, something like that. So once you have it to where you want it, you can kind of lock that in. I'm going to check some of my other settings here. I kind of went through and pre-did all the settings for this file, so everything else should be good to go. That's the only thing I'm going to change right now. And everything is set to be really low draft quality. So if I hit render here, we're going to see what we get. And one other thing I want to do real quick, I rendered this out. I don't know if you guys can, it's pretty dark on my screen. If I maybe zoom into this area, you can't see shit. So anyway, if you can see on your screens, there's actually displacement on that far wall. So what I want to do is I want to come under my Vray tab. I want to go under my global switches here. So I'm under the Vray tab in the render setup, under the global switches. I'm going to turn off this displacement that's on that wall, which is going to speed up my rendering. I mean, in the end, that wall is going to be brick. But for right now, I just want to get my lighting sorted out because you can see it is very dark in this scene. Just grabbing that camera, moving the sun, and not really messing with anything. So I want to turn off the displacement so when I hit render here, you see my last render time was 23 seconds. If I hit render here, it's basically loading right away, rendering right away, and it's just a little bit faster for me. So this last render took 7 seconds versus 20 seconds. So, it's just a kind of a personal preference to turn that off so it's fast. No, it's actually like taking the geometry. So the displacement is taking that geometry, which is just flat, and it's basically popping out the bricks. I mean, like, it's literally, if you were to go in there and cut it up where you have your joints, and then you take the faces that are in brick and extrude them out. That's what that's doing for you with an image.
We'll go over that in 2 classes.
Yeah.
What's the chart you just brought up?
That is the color correction stuff, which is, I don't know if you can see the difference in that or not. What I can do is I guess I can really crank this up. It's through the Vray frame buffer. Yeah. And it's just letting me adjust the image brightness. You can see I'm toggling it down here. And it's just like a feature that is in the frame buffer. I actually want to clear that out. So I think I need to, do I right click or do I, well, I'm just going to turn it off here. And I'm going to close out of this. So I just have my frame buffer that's open. So make sure you have this button, use the color curve correction off, and the show color correction panel over here, just make sure you turn those 2 things off. I mean, that's basically like an in-max editor. If you were doing stuff in Photoshop, you could brighten your image or do whatever. You can do those same manipulations here at the bottom. That's all that's doing. But I mean, I'm not concerned with that. I want to focus more on the lighting. So one of the first things I'm going to do is, now that my displacement is off here, I'm going to get out of my render setup. I want to come back and I want to select my camera. So I click in the top left and I go to select camera. And I'm going to come down and I want to drop my shutter speed value to something like 50. And I'm going to click render again. You can start to see my image on the screen there a little bit. It's still fairly dark at this point. But I mean, overall, it definitely does look quite a bit better from where we started. So the next thing we want to do is we want to get some fill lights into this space. And in order to do that, I'm going to get out of that view, so I'm just going to close out of that. Hit T for top on my keyboard. And I want to, I'm going to hit F3 just so I can see the outlines of these skylights up here. And there's two things that I can do now for my basically lighting in the room to give it more of a diffuse kind of character where the light is filling the room more and we don't have such a dark character to that rendering. One of the things that we can do is we can come under the Create panel and go to the Vray lights. And from the drop down, select Vray and then grab Vray light. And with that button active, make sure it's a plane. The multiplier and color and all that really doesn't matter. And I'm going to go over to my skylight here, just kind of click and drag over it. Now of course right now it's perfectly flat, so if I hold Alt and kind of come in here, it's flat and it's on the 0. So I got to hit W on my keyboard and raise this guy up to my skylight. And then if I right click under my rotate up here, that'll give me the ability to either enter in a value for my rotation, which in the Y. So I think I want to be at minus 40, I think. So it looks like minus 35 degrees to get the rotation right here. And I hit F3 to toggle the shade view back on and F4 to see my lines. I hit W on the keyboard to bring my gizmo back up, and I'm just going to drop this down a little bit so that it's sitting just on the inside of the window there. And the last thing I want to do is I come back to my modify panel with that light selected. And from the modify panel, I'm going to adjust the overall height of this, which is the length here, just so that it fills that entire window. So if I hit my camera view again, you can see that one that's up there in my skylight. If I hit T and then Z, that takes me back to here. What I want to do is I want to hold Shift now on my keyboard and click and drag this over to the next skylight. When I release, I want to make sure that I select it as an instance. I know Brian talked a little bit last week about creating instances with geometry, saving you with lighting calculations. It's the same type of idea. If you have just one light, it's going to do the calculations once for that light versus having multiple lights. Also, if I change any parameters on that one light, it's going to change for all of the lights. So I have 4 skylights here. So I just want to copy this over again and make it an instance. And I'm going to do that one more time. Hold Shift, click, drag it over, release, and make sure that's an instance. So I have my lights in place for the skylights. And I don't really want them to be a light. The sun is my light. So what I'm actually going to do is now come down to my modify panel. And I want to switch this over to be just a portal for the light that is my sun in the environment. So all I have to do is just check this here, and you can see that automatically deactivates these above it. And as soon as I activate that skylight portal, what this is now doing is it's essentially acting as a filter for the sunlight. So it's grabbing that and kind of amplifying it in a way and filtering it through as, basically as these windows are doing naturally. So it's kind of recreating that and giving you that GI and that bounce and that soft kind of diffuse quality in your space. And the whole, you know, I said before, the multiplier, the color doesn't matter. All that stuff becomes inactive as soon as I deactivate it by selecting the skylight portal. And that's the same for all of these. So if I select this, since it's an instance, all of those guys have those exact same properties. I don't have to worry about, you know, those lights. I can then click, and I'm just going to drag this over, make another instance of it, and if I hit E on my keyboard for rotate, since it's opposite here, instead of -35, 35, and then W to move it, and I'll just move it into place over here. Then I'll go back into my top view, T for top, Z for zoom, and hold shift and just kind of place this over here in this window. And again, make sure it's an instance and not a copy or a reference. So all those guys are in my skylights right now. The next thing I want to do is I want to swing this around, because we have two windows over here on the side of our building. So if I hit F for front and F3 to bring it into my wireframe mode, that brings these two windows up here. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to create another light. I could create another light and do the same thing, make it a skylight portal. But again, I can't stress enough making instances of things, especially when it comes to you know, more complex scenes. So if you have your geometry instanced when you can, if you have your lights instanced when you can, I mean, you're just going to save an incredible amount of time when you go to render it. When you're doing your renderings and I hit that render button, your light cache calculations really shouldn't be taking more than a few minutes after you turn it up for your final production. I mean, if I'm running these previews here, you can see as soon as I hit render, I know this really isn't a view, but that light cache took, you know, just a few seconds, and then the irradiance map took a few seconds, and then it's going into the actual rendering of it, and it's, you know, it's done in 7 seconds. So I mean, if you start having multiple things around and it's doing calculations for all of these things separately, all you're going to do is increase your render time. So it doesn't really make sense to make a new light. I'm going to hold shift, bring this down over here, and again make it an instance. And once I kind of have that in place, I got to hit E on my keyboard to bring up the rotate. I could come up here at the top and select my rotate tool as well. And I'm just going to control it here, put it back to 0, and then I want to flip it around in the Z, I believe, 90 degrees. Is it the Z or the, I guess it's the Y. Yeah, so it'd be the Y90, and then maybe then it's the Z90. Yeah, so the Y90, the Z90. Actually, if I go into my top view and check this, yeah. So I can see the arrow is facing into the building here. So if I hit F again on my keyboard to get out of top view, Z for zoom, I can see that's here in the window, but it doesn't quite line up. Now I don't want to change the parameters. If I come over to the modify panel and I come down, I don't necessarily want to change the size here, because as soon as I do that, it's going to change for every instance that I have. But what I can do is I can hit R on my keyboard, or I can select the scale tool up here, and I can scale this to fit the window. Again, you don't have to be super precise. This is just kind of acting as a filter to intensify your sunlight. In fact, the top of it's curved, so I'm going to oversize it a little bit just so it's over top of it. And if I hit T for my top view, Z for zoom, I just want to bring this into where those green mullions are. And then I'm going to hold shift. Well, I guess I could hit F for front, Z for zoom, and then I'm going to hold shift and again bring this over to here and make this an instance. So I basically have two lights in my scene right now. I have my sun, and I have my V-Ray light, which is acting as basically a sky portal, which really is just a filter for my sun. So I mean, if you think about it, I still just have my sun in the scene for this interior scene. Yeah, I mean, that's why the arrow's on it. So if I hit T for top and Z for zoom, yeah. I mean, otherwise your light is just going to be going out the window. So if they're, you know, which doesn't really make sense, especially if you're using a sky portal. So yeah, you want to make sure your arrow is facing into the building. So if I hit C for my camera, and then render this out, it's starting to look a little bit better in terms of balancing the light out in the corners here. It's not as dark. I mean, overall it's still fairly dark, but it's not as dark as it was before. I do want to come back. I'm going to adjust my camera again. So I come back to the Vray physical camera and select the camera here. Come over to my modify panel. And I'm going to come down. And I'll drop this down maybe to like 30, something like that. And render this out again. So as I'm looking at this, I mean, overall it's fairly balanced when I'm looking, you know, here in the corners of my scene, coming across the bottom. You know, the really only hot spots are where I'm seeing the direct sky here from my skylights and where the sun is coming in and hitting the floor. So I mean, that's really my only direct kind of intense spots here. Everything else is kind of nice and fairly balanced coming across. It's not very dark in the corners and you know, light here where this light is coming in. So I'm fairly happy with the overall general setup of this and how this looks right now. Yeah.
What's the difference between the Vray without sky photo and have the sky photo? I think that it's one nice.
You're asking what's the difference between the light and the sky portal?
I think maybe turn off the sky photo is more light and more.
Yeah, if you turn off the sky portal, it's basically just the light that you're adding to your scene. The whole reason I switched it on to be a sky portal is because then the only light in my scene is the sun. And all that's doing is just filtering the light. So I mean, it's acting more as something to direct and amplify the sun in order to balance out my interior space a little bit more. So I didn't want to add another light into my scene. So I'm using that to basically channel my sun. So I still just really have one light, which is the sun, and that's it. Now the other thing, I mentioned there's two different ways you can do this. So if I hit T for my top and Z for zoom, I'm just going to hit Shift G and hide my geometry, and Shift C and hide my camera. I'm going to turn off my grid, just personal, whatever choice there. So I'm going to delete out my skylights. And then I'm going to hit Shift G and show my geometry again. Now what I want to do is I want to come over to my create panel. So the other thing you could do, which is actually creating a light in the scene, like I said before we did this portal, which is acting more of a filter to kind of intensify your sun. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a box in my space. So I'm going to click and drag over and just come up a little bit and then click. And if I come over to my modify panel, I can raise the height of it up a little bit. Maybe not quite that much. I'll just raise this up some. Then what I want to do is I want to hit T for top, Z for zoom, and I want to put an edit poly on top of that box. I'm going to go into my edge sub-selection over here. And I could either do a quick slice or slice plane. I'll do slice plane, just so it's easier for you guys to kind of see what's going on. I'll switch over to my rotate here. I can hit E on the keyboard, or I could select the rotate from up here on top. And I want to make sure that under my snaps panel here, that my angle snap is turned on. So that way when I click and drag to rotate this, if you watch down here at the bottom, as I'm rotating, it's snapping to every 5 degrees. So when it gets to 90, I let go. And then I'm going to come over here and just hit slice one time on my panel. Come back up, get out of that edge subset. And if I hold Alt and hit my scroll button to kind of zoom around here, I can see I put a slice there. In my box, I'm going to go back into the edge subset. I just want that top edge. I'll hit W and I'm going to raise that guy up just so that it's kind of similar to the space that it's in. Again, you don't have to be super precise here. It's just kind of eyeballing this stuff. And I want to get out of that edge subset. I'm going to hit R for scale because I want to scale this down just a little bit so it's not really touching anything. Kind of imagine putting a volume within a volume. So I just want this kind of floating in the interior of the space. I'm going to hit T for top again and Z for zoom. And what I'm actually going to do so you guys can just kind of see this a little bit better, I'm going to right click and do isolate selection. So I have just that box that I've created. And if I hit F for front, Z for zoom, you can see there's the front view of it. Go back into my top view, go over to my create panel, go over to my lights, and again from the Vray lights, I'm going to select Vray light, only this time with it active instead of plane. I'm going to come down to mesh. I'm going to make sure I turn off the skylight portal option over here. And I just want it to affect the diffuse and the specular. And I'm going to turn off the reflections. Now once I have that set up, so it's mesh without the portal and without the reflections, I'm going to click somewhere on the screen to create that. Once that's created, I'm going to go under my modify panel then, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom here where it says pick mesh. I'm going to click that and select that mesh. Now what that has essentially done is basically converted that into a light for me. But 30 is going to be way too high for my light. I mean, this is just like a general kind of fill light. So we'll do a value of like 2. Now I want to bring back my other geometry, which on my screen there's usually a little exit from isolation here, or there should be if you isolated your geometry stuff. You can also hit escape, I think. Or maybe not. I think I got to do unhide all. Shoot. Let's try this. Isolate selection. There it is. Exit isolation. Unhide all. Now you know what? If I hit Shift G, is it? Oh, it's because it's an XREF. So I actually have to go under my start logo, go to reference, go to XREF scene. What it did was it defaulted this off. So I'm just going to turn that back on to be visible, and it should reappear. So I had to go under my references and make sure that it came back on under my XREF scene panel. And that's because my isolate selection was off. I should be able to click something, right click, do isolate selection, and then hit exit, and it comes back. It's just because on my screen that button was missing because I'm usually working with 2 monitors. Alright, so once I have the light in here, I'm going to then hold shift. I'm going to kind of bring it over to this other space, make it an instance. Hit C for my camera, and we'll render this out and see what it looks like. And with my light selected, one last thing I forgot to check. I want to make sure that light is invisible. And I'll click render again. So you should have something like this, and you can see it's pretty stark white now in terms of everything being balanced out. And again, don't worry about the artifacts that are on the screen. It's because my settings are incredibly low, just so that this thing runs super fast. If I really wanted to, I could come down to where my subdivides are here, crank them up, hit render again, and that's going to clean it up. But that's just because I have my global subdivides turned down super low so that this thing is going to render out fairly quick. I mean, again, all I'm interested in is just looking at the overall lighting quality, balance quality within this space. So I mean, I really don't need, you know, my subdivides or anything kind of turned up. I can have everything super low and still get a general sense of what the lighting is doing in the space. So with that, I'm going to stop it here. We're going to take a break.